Hi there, welcome to the Alpha Wave Trader week ahead. Wow, what a week it might be. Woke up this morning wondering what to talk to you about, and we have Trump tweeting about the US-China trade deal, saying that he's upping the tariffs on Friday. This could be a final argy-bargy. Who knows? The volatility could really pick up. Does Trump back down in a few days if China comes to the table and does what he wants from a negotiating perspective? I guess that's possible, but boy, it's a pretty big announcement, and the market is at all-time highs, having had a massive bull run. It's gapped down 50 points on the open, the S&P 500, the futures on the S&P 500, and that is the first sort of sign of trading that we've been able to see, apart from some of the currencies starting to move, and you've got to keep your eye on the US yen, Euro yen, Aussie yen. If they really start to go, now I can't discuss the currencies too much, but if they start really moving, there's some unwinding of large positions starting to happen. And the Nikkei looks pretty interesting to me, testing the sell zone of its monthly sell pivot candle. Everything looking like it could get a bit hairy from here. So if we just have a quick look at the weekly on the E-mini S&P 500, this is that big sell-off, 20% collapse. The Fed changes their tune, and off we go to the races, all the way back to the high without stopping. And on a weekly basis, there's been no sell pivot since the rally began. So if we look at this from the weekly perspective, we have the lowest price candle there. We have the weekly buy pivot there. And then we've just started marching higher with new key bars marching higher. So every time you get a new closing high above the high of the previous key bar, that's your next key bar. So that's not a key bar. That's not a key bar. So that's just giving you the sense of the rally. So we've just had this constant move up, and last week was another key bar higher, touching the all-time high, and it's always a risky proposition when you do just retest a high. Basically, it's taken everyone out. So if you were a seller in that period, if you'd sold here, for example, and felt you were a genius, and then you watched all your profits disappear, and maybe you even held on further, but you've had a really rough ride and possibly dumped your position. So it's really taken everyone out, and if it does just tap this high and sell off, it can be a pretty sharp move. This week, it'll have been an interesting week, this one, because the low of last week's, so this is where the sell pivot will happen on the weekly basis, is if we see a close below that low, which is 29.01, was last week's low in the E-mini. So let's see whether it can close below there at the end of the week. But if Trump's tweet is anything to go by, this candle could be a pretty bad one. And from there, we can see what happens. But and I'd be really wanting to wait for that weekly sell pivot to actually occur, because it has been just such an immensely strong trend, and it really has been trading off this weekly in the past. Once you just let that weekly play out, so maybe in the middle of the week, Trump's going to come out and say something and reverse what he said, and off we go to the upside again. And it's all just been a bit of a shakeout. So it's not decided as yet, but it's a very interesting situation, having just tapped the all-time high and everyone excited about a deal happening, everything being bought up in this period with that expectation. And we had the Fed last week saying, well, we're not overly sure we're going to be cutting rates this year, and with employment, so strong, growth picking back up, China loosening the spigots again. There's reasons why this could be reversed quite rapidly. So just looking at this wave all the way higher to retest, the midpoint of that coming in around 26.50. It could be heading back to there, and who knows how it does it or how long it takes, but you can see what can happen when the music stops. It can have massive moves in the 1 week. So I guess that would be the risk this week, is if the writing's on the wall and this weekly sell pivot towards the end of the week is looking like it's definitely happening, it might get things really moving. So it'll be a very interesting week to watch this one, see how it pans out, and what Trump is going to let loose. Oil prices also turning down. We've got a weekly sell pivot in oil. So this is oil going back all the way to 2013. So we've got the collapse from over $100 and prices recovering over the last few years before really getting hammered towards the end of last year. And this has been a recovery rally going into what is the sell zone of the recovery wave. So we've got the areas there, the blue areas, being the buy and sell zone of this recovery wave. And this actual sell-off nearly went all the way into that buy zone area, and in actual fact what it bounced from was the buy zone of just this wave. So if we just analyze how this has developed, we've got this structure there, and then we've sold off right to the bottom of the buy zone of that up wave within the trend, and then we've rallied, and you can see there that here is the sell zone of that down wave. So we have this big wave here, we've got the sell zone of that coming in here, and you can see prices there getting very close to that sell zone, and then having a weekly sell pivot, which was confirmed last week. So a dangerous spot to have a weekly sell pivot for oil, with the overhang of this huge sell-off, and then prices finding that selling again, and now rallying into where you'd expect there to be big selling pressure if this bigger picture weakness is around. So just from this point of view, oil prices just looking a bit dangerous. May see a bit of thrashing around, but ultimately with this weekly sell pivot in place, until we see the weekly buy pivot, I'd be tending to think oil prices can come back off, and you could just look at the wave higher here of how it responds, and back to the midpoint would be your first bet, and then it might attempt to rally, but then if it can't, you're going to be heading to the buy zone of that wave, and then maybe a bit more thrashing around, but then that's when it gets big picture is busting below the low of that wave. Would be very bearish for oil, being the most recent highest low within this whole move higher. So a failure below there would be very bearish indeed, and that may not be for another year or so, who knows. But just the way it is acting in this spot is where I'd expect it to see weakness. It has actually tapped the sell zone of this whole wave higher, so it has actually tapped that now, and the midpoint of that coming in around 52. So from here, on this weekly move, we could see oil back to 52, and it wouldn't take too long. So from here, yes, on oil, I'd be just a bit wary with Trump possibly stepping up the rhetoric and actually acting on those tariffs. It could knock the stuffing out of oil, and also gold looking like it can actually turn back up. But we've run out of time, I think. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but looking at where the market is, that S&P 500 futures, funnily enough, flirting with the low of last week. I'm currently trading at 29.02, and the low from last week 29.01, as I was saying. So there'll be quite a battle here, whether it's just going to be tapping that low and then heading back up, shaking out all the people who jumped on with the market falling 50 points on the open. But conversely, it's pretty big news, and if this low does really give way, especially in the overnight market, it can get pretty hairy pretty quickly. So be on alert for what can happen this week. Cheers. I'll come back with more next week.